The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments of the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapped General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy for not being springtime, and it was in the clammy month that the H.G. men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son Harrison away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, well, his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantages of their brain. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm.
That was a real pretty dance, that dance I just did.
Said Hazel.
Huh?
Said George.
That dance, it was nice.
Said Hazel.
Yup.
Said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't very good, no better than anybody else would have been anyways. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked, so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face, would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did the 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been.
Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball peen hammer,
Said George.
I think it will be real interesting hearing all the different sounds.
Said Hazel, a little envious.
All the things they think up.
Said George.
Only, if I was Handicapped General, you know what would I do?
Said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the Handicapped General, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers.
If I was Diana Moon Glampers,
Said Hazel.
I'd have chimps on Sunday, just chimps. Kind of in honor of religion. I could think, if I was just chimps.
Said George.
Well, maybe, and am real loud.
Said Hazel.
I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else.
Said George.
Who knows better than I what normal is?
Said Hazel.
Right.
Said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gunshot salute in his head stopped that.
Why?
Said Hazel.
That's a doozy, wasn't it?
It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor and were holding their temples.
All of a sudden you look so tired.
Said Hazel.
Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch?
She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshots in the canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck.
Go on and rest the bag for a little while.
She said.
I don't care if you're not equal for me for a while.
George weighed the bag in his hands.
I don't mind it.
He said.
I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately. Kind of wore out.
Said Hazel.
If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls. Just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out.
Said George.
I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take a few out when you came from work.
Said Hazel.
I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I try to get away with it,
Said George.
then other people get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back to the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it.
said Hazel.
There you are.
Said George.
The minute people start cheating on us, what do you think happens to society?
If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head.
Reckon I'd fall apart.
Said Hazel.
What would?
Said George blankly.
Society.
Said Hazel uncertainly.
Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows?
Said George.